for Jay. Yeah, make sure they're working. Go ahead. What's that? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If anything goes wrong, just come and stop me in the middle. How's it sound now? Okay or not? You can hear it in there? I don't want the what? Okay. Hoping everything works. Good luck, everybody. This is a week when a lot of people are out of town. I must have been originally scheduled to go out of town because I don't know why I had it as a gap. So we're working as best we can. Avram is away, Bill Sachs is away, Jake is holding the fort, Howard's holding the fort. Let's just hope everything works tonight. So if you see funny things happening in the front, it's that kind of an evening. So I start by saying good luck to everybody, and as always, we want to thank Shomrei Emunah for being our host. Right? And of course to the RZA in Baltimore for sponsoring the whole series over here. Tonight, as you can see, this is the Elbaums are the sponsors tonight over here. In memory of Judy's Aunt Esther, Nathan, and Judy's uncle. So this, in other words, it's Mrs. Elbaum's father's brother and sister. That's what it boils down to. I see in a note that these are people who lived on my block, right? Because I grew up in Norfolk Avenue. I'm sure everybody knows where that is. If they didn't, you have no business living in Baltimore. I lived next door to the Beth Phillip. Which was a big building once upon a time. Anyway, and I see these are people grow. I wonder if I must have known them. Right? It's interesting. What was the name? Nathanson? Yeah, I had to know them because if you lived where I lived, everybody knew each other more or less. And I see they're described as many of the people that I knew in those days, which were very strongly committed to Israel. This was the big cause in those. There were good Jews. Members of the Jewish community at that time. This neighborhood is gone. It hasn't been really successfully replaced. But I guess I'm wasting my time on most of you trying to describe it. So anyway, don't believe what you read in the Barry Levinson movies. You understand? He was a jerk and his family were all a bunch of lowlifes, and therefore they always made movies about the Forest Park Shalmata. I lived in the Forest Park Shalmila, which really had nice, all kidding aside, really had nice people, had flourishing shuls, and things like this, and they had good people, some religion, not really, whatever it was according to days, but really was very good. And it's these are their children, so to speak. In other words, they didn't have any kids, so their memory is kept alive in their relatives. And I think it speaks a lot that the relatives are so moved to want to dedicate something in the year 2015 in their memory, and we do pay tribute to their honor. It goes without saying that I couldn't get any of this done between Ari Elbaum and between Howard Elbaum and Judy Elbaum. This is not going to happen, baby. So I think we all ought to give them a period of applause. Howard is able to marry his professionalism to my amateurism, and then you end up with the product that we get. If it was two amateurs, vey. So without any further ado, I do want to call attention to the fact, first of all, let's go back, and you see there's a different schedule. So do pay attention to this one. It should be coming out in the Where When this week, or you go on my show, website, or you go to my website. The point is, don't use your old schedule, use this one. I don't know how many times I have to say in people's heads, and I know there are certain type of people in Baltimore, you can tell them 25 times, they'll say, but I saw it 6 months ago, it said something different. Just get used to it, that this is the new schedule. All right, Jews. Now, that's number one, and number two, Mirza Hashem, I'm going to do this. Hi. See, number two, this is going to happen. This is the second series, and it's going to happen right after this one. And as of this moment, the first two will be in Shomrei. So the bottom, I don't know what's going to be the next five. So the bottom line is that when we finish the series that I'm currently in, you ain't done with me yet, okay? Well, some of you may be, but Saturday night at the movies will continue. Although I warn you, this is strictly for intellectuals and pseudo-intellectuals. I said before, to be interested in Israel, you could be anybody. To be interested in some famous Jewish historians, what can I tell you? But we will be here, Motzi Shabbos, and obviously as the day gets longer, we'll have to move to 8:30, 9 o'clock, whatever it is. So all I can tell you is, if you're interested, stay tuned. can either follow where when it went or on my show website. No, if you want to, you will find out. But the first two will be here. I'm hoping the others will, but that's not clear at all. So I'm just telling you, February 21, February 28 is nailed down, and it will be here in Chambray. After that, Wandering Jew, we will find out. Without any further ado, let's get down to business. Tonight, as always, we have a lot of ground to cover. And tonight, we're doing the 11th out of 14 in the series called The Ben Gurion Era at High Noon, Israel and the Jews, 1957 to 61. This is number 11, Zionist Economics, Israel's Economic Growth and Its Problems, 57 to 61, which is a very serious topic. Economics is usually called a dismal science, but it really isn't. I'm not an economist at all. I just know what I know from history. But economics is actually a humanistic discipline, that much I know, because it deals with how people behave under certain stimuli, correct? It's not a magic law of supply and demand. When there's a smaller demand, people will tend to do certain things. You understand? These are the various laws that they try to find as how does the human behavior. So it's actually extremely interesting. But we're going to deal with the Israeli example and a very specific one, Ben Gurion era at high noon. How did Israel function economically and therefore in many other ways socially as well? So right off the bat, when we talk about these years, we're talking about the Mapai economy. Israel was not a single party government. No, Israel was a single party government. Meaning, as we've been talking about over here, Mapai had the command of the government, even though they didn't have majority of the votes, but they always put together a coalition, especially Ben Gurion's time, and the source of their power, the key to their power, was their running of the economy. This is a very smart insight on their part. You don't have to have a gun at people's head. If you control the economic levers, then you can get a lot done. It's not as consistently socialist as the Mapai and the rest of the left. If you would ask the leader of the Mapam party, Tabenkin here, somebody else, he says, oh, Mapai is capitalist and all that. But he's to the left of Lenin, anything in which the government doesn't own everything, you see, was considered insufficiently capitalist. The Mapai was shrewder. They say, you don't have to own everything. People can own little stores and business and things like this, but the biggies, we control, you see. In real terms, this is not about economics, it's about power, controlling capital and labor in order to keep getting elected. It's as old as America. Harry Hopkins in the New Deal famously said what? This is a famous line. We'll tax and tax, spend and spend, elect and elect. Roosevelt was elected 4 times. Okay? And a lot of it had to do with the fact that he used government money to give people jobs in this place, and therefore they will vote for Roosevelt. You see? And for the Democratic Party. This is how the Democratic busted its cycle of always losing, because they always lost the Republicans after the Civil War. And then after Roosevelt, they started a cycle of winning, because it's not their money, someone else's money. You take money, tax. That's exactly what the Mapai did. Plus in Israel, in order to add to this, you have to factor in the unusual reality of what they call the Histadrut, which means that what we call in America the AFL-CIO, which is moribund today, but once upon a time wasn't. So the AFL-CIO, all the unions. In Israel, the labor groups put together an official union, and they killed out all the other unions who competed with them. This happened already in the 30s. You hear what I say, 30s? And so one large labor federation, like a cartel, was controlled by the Mapai. The boss over there, David Cohen, and others were members of the Mapai. They control the labor markets. In other words, they have the power to make sure you, an employer, will get workers, won't get workers, under what conditions, not conditions, access to capital very often, things of this nature. And it's crazy in the sense that the AFL-CIO created the state of Israel. You know what I'm saying? In other words, the Histadrut's political arm was the Mapai party. The Mapai party, leading other parties, actually physically created the state of Israel. They raised the army. They set up the financial system to run the place. And so it's not like other countries in which you have a capitalist system and the labor unions have to fight to get their piece of the action. Here, lechatchila, from the very beginning of the state, the labor unions have a lot more power than the regular businessman. So the idea of somebody coming, as many would have perhaps, in Israel, to Israel, in 48, 49, 50, all those years, and saying, I'm a businessman. I'll give you a very good example, because this happens a lot, what I'm about to say. Guys from America or South Africa would come in 49, 50, 51, 52 in those years, and they say, I'm a pretty prosperous guy where I live. I have a lumber business, I have a clothing business, I deal with this commodity, that one. I'm pretty successful in my home territory. I own a couple of houses in America and South Africa and Canada. I own a supermarket. I want to, and I'm a good Jew. And so what I do is, I have, let's say, $500,000 to play with in the 50s. There's $500,000 to play with. I'm going to come to Israel. I'm going to invest in something and create a business over there. I'll employ people. I'll make money. And that'll be my unique way. See, because I know the grocery store business or the supermarket business or the gas business or the furniture business or the lumber business, and I'm going to contribute my know-how, whatever, to Israel. Of course, I want to make a profit too. That's the name of the game. That's how I operate in my home country. That's what I do in Israel. So get out of my way and let me do my thing and see what happened. Now, there were actually potentially 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 Jews like this that I just described. Maybe some of you had grandparents, relatives of the type that I'm describing of here. It could be a successful, nice Jew from Denver, from Memphis, from Seattle, from Toronto, from London, from Switzerland, from Cape Town, from Johannesburg, from Melbourne. They had a lot of people like this from Mexico City, and they want to do it. But you come to Israel, and the guy said like this. He says, I want to set up a business. No, you can't set up a business. First, you got to talk to so-and-so. We'll talk to so-and-so. And what they want to say is like this. They said, well, you can set this up, but we get 51% of the control of the business. He said, wait a minute, it's my money. He said, I know, but we get 51% of the control of business. And not only that, but we'll tell you who you can hire under what circumstances. No, I want to hire who I want to hire. See, that's how I operate my home territory. I may negotiate with the labor unions over, and personnel policies and things of this nature. No, you're going to hire who we send you, and you're going to pay him $12 an hour. I can't pay $12 an hour. It's not, I want to make a profit. You're going to pay $12 an hour. That's so what does this guy say? He said, let me think this. He's a nice guy. So he said, let me think this over. He gets on the next plane. He's out of there. You understand? And what he'll do is, every year, since he's a nice guy, so in the synagogue, for the Israel bonds, he'll buy a bond for $1,000 and $2,000. You understand? And he is a nice guy. You get what I'm saying? He's not saying I'm anti-Israel. But the real contribution that he could possibly have made doesn't happen. I know people in Baltimore like that. Maybe some of you do. I'm sure you know people around the world like this. This is what happens. But the Mapai said like this. He said, we don't want people coming in, and then the guy we're talking about has political power in Israel that can fight us. You know, because that is true. Capital brings capitalism. Capitalism brings power. I've heard of a country called America in which the capitalists have a certain amount of power in the political system. And maybe I'm wrong, not in Maryland, but everywhere else. You understand? And that laws are passed which work for the big boys and not for the other. In Israel, they say, no, we're the big boys, the Mapai party. The law is for us. We're not going to have foreign capital again. So because of this, you end up, there are competing ideas of capitalism and socialism, let's face it. The ideological opposition on the part of Mapai was to an untrammeled capitalism where the rich control the politics of the state. Ben Gurion said, we didn't fight to put together in Israel and, have the sweat of the kibbutz and fighting the Arabs, all the rest of it, so some fat chum from Baltimore could come and start to, throw his weight around and get people elected in the Knesset and all. Yeah. We, the ones who built it, we will have that power. So you can understand where it's coming from. The question is from the point of view of pure economics. Does it work? The demands of Zionism itself from early on, and I mentioned this a week or two ago, required violating the rules of economics. The Jews could not have a foothold in Israel without this sort of thing that you see on the map over here, on the screen over here right now, about Avodah Ivrit. As I said before, how could any worker, starting from 1910 or 1920, come to Israel and get a job? You can't compete against the Arabs because they'll work for a nickel. And a Jew usually won't work for a nickel. He'll say, he's got an alternative. He said, I'll go back to Poland. Or I'll move to a country called America or Canada or someplace like that. And I won't have to live under those conditions. And so it wasn't realistic for the Zionist movement to be able to have the slightest foothold without a certain artificial economic system violating the basic rules of economics. So when you see movies and films about the kibbutz is a phony. It couldn't make it on its own. It can only make it when people in Baltimore send them money to make up for the shortfalls and the extra expenses that they can't cover. But the attitude, people in Baltimore did do it, and elsewhere around the world, because they said, it's important for us to have a kibbutz near Tiberia, near Haifa. It's a Jewish presence. You understand? And, if you're romantic and you don't mind lying to yourself, you say, they're living the life where everybody owns everything, and it's an ideal existence of a socialist commune and all the rest of it. But in hard dollars and cents, they couldn't make it, you see? So what are we supposed to do? Say, because the iron rules of economics make it that we can't have a Jewish state, I guess we'll put off for another 100 years or 200 years? Or do we say we'll do whatever it takes to put together a Jewish state now, and the heck with economics? So you don't look at economics and the rules of economics as a hard and fast rule, but you have a certain contempt for them, partially because you have to, and partially because you can. Because there are richer Jews in London and Antwerp and elsewhere who will send you money. They will do it. And so I'm trying to show you that it woven into the very fabric, maybe even till today, less so today, but certainly for a long time, certainly in the whole Ben Gurion area, woven into the fabric of a state of Israel is the notion that he says it can't really run as a successful business. Get it? And if anybody makes that demand, the country will just will close up. The last guy out, turn off the lights. So this is very important. Now, what I said may have been true up to 48, but when Israel becomes a state in 48, the demands of the new state of Israel, it's a real country, are of a different nature. And now, you kind of have to listen a little bit more to the rules of economics, you see? Because you cannot violate them with impunity. But political and security concerns still require certain violations of economics. For example, here's a map, and you can see on the map, Ari Petuach. These are development towns that Israel set up. Now, why they put a town here or here in the deep in the Negev or up there right next to the Arabs? They did so for political reasons, for Zionist reasons. We don't want to have that the whole Shetach of the Negev doesn't have any Jewish settlement. After all, Nasser might say, nobody's living there anyway, give it to us. You see? Or they might say the whole area of the north is all Arab with no Jews, which was true in some areas, so therefore give it to Syria or whatever. So for politics reasons, it's necessary to establish a Jewish presence there. Notice a whole bunch of little towns and things like that over here, right next to the borders. Classic Ben Gurion policy, Arei HaSafar, which is, if we don't establish a physical Jewish city and a presence near the border, then the Arabs will come to move closer and closer and take over more and more parts of the border. So everything I just talked about, it requires a violation of economics. Because from a bottom line point of view, right, from a strictly purely economic point of view, you'll say it's more economical to concentrate people in a large urban center, to establish something over here. Don't put a small group down here. They have to build the houses and bring the water down to them in Mitzvah Ramon or someplace like that, and provide extra military security. And build highways and roads to nowhere. It doesn't make any sense from a dollars and cents point of view. And so what I'm trying to show you is that even after 1948-49, in spite of the fact that all this is a drain on the regular economic kinds of planning, it was necessary, my friends. You see? They said, we got to do it. And so the whole idea of Zionism, particularly in its early years, implied a kind of a contempt for economics, you see? Because their attitude is, if we listen to you guys, the professors from the universities and the others, we wouldn't be here in the first place. You know the old Jewish story. The guy sends his son, he has a grocery store, and he sends his son off to Harvard, and he stays for many years, and the guy come back with a whole economics degree from Harvard, and he says, Pop, let me look at your books. I could put this shop in the 20th century. And he shows him the books. He said, you've been broke for 5 years. You understand? The father says, you schmendrick with my 5 years broke. I put you through Harvard. And already you got your stupid degree. This is the notion that you had. That was the attitude of Ben Gurion, let's put it that way. We have to put Jews in the Negev and in the Galil, whether it makes economic sense or not. Now, nobody wants to go. Certainly you don't want to go to the Negev. Send the Sephardim. So here we see, no. Here we see a key element of the early and even current economics of Israel, racism. That's the way it goes. Now that's true in the United States of America. We have groups that are on top and bottom of the economic scale and get hurt based on ethnicity, on race and things. That's part of the ugly story of America. It's part of the ugly story of Israel too. That's what I want to get across. Just get used to it. Because if immigrants come from Poland, Romania, America, and Israel say, you got to go live in the Negev, they'll say, we're going back. But if they come from Iraq, they can't go back because they'll kill them. So this is a hard and cold reality in which the Ben Gurion area is one in which the economics blends together with the racism to produce the brew that emerges. Now, again, all this violates the economics, but they said they got to do it. You see, better we have a Sephardic presence in Mitzvah Ramon or in a Tivot or Yerucham or someplace like that than to have no presence at all. Then in addition to what I'm talking about, what starts to happen as the 50s unfold, as I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, is they make a lot of mistakes, and they start to learn hard way from the mistakes. Now, if they read a book on economics, they wouldn't have made the mistake, but they got to learn the hard way. And the problem is that you end up with, I guess what we say, the worst form of crony capitalism. You understand? Because once they start to build enterprises, and they figure this, you have to make the economy a little bit more modern, and the government owns all the money, and the Histadrut commands all the economic levers, then they will give the prizes to whoever they want to. This is a crony capitalism that we're familiar with all the third world countries. And so Pinchas Sapir is going to be the key figure in all this. Now his real name is Kozlowski. I don't know if he's related to Bernie Kozlowski or not, but in Israel, you don't want to go around with a name like Kozlowski, so they put it Sapir. Well, his mother's name was Saperstein, so that's how he did it. It's really amazing how the who was who. But anyway, he's the guy. Eshkol is Ben-Gurion's guy, and he's Eshkol's guy. These two guys control the economy and all the economic planning. Neither of them went to school, okay? But both of them are absolutely dedicated, and they figured that sweat and hard work will replace, book learning and things of this nature. And we will talk about this. Now, the problem with everything I said is, life is funny. When you run out of money, you run out of money. It's a funny thing, Hope nobody has to learn that. So what do? Well, that's a good question. The plus of socialism, has minuses and pluses, is planning. Okay, this was the great plus of socialism, especially in the first half of the 20th century. That whereas in an unplanned capitalist economy, all these redundancies and 10 people go into the same business and things of this nature, and next thing you know, needed resources that could be used in another sector of the economy are wasted in this sector of the economy, and so on and so forth. If you have a planning commission, if it's done by the government or some public body like that, they will say, we have so many eggs and so much oil and so much this, and we will send them to the right area. The state of it, now there is truth to some of this. You need a certain amount of planning. In America, you have this too. Question is, how do you manage the existential tension, I say, between the demands over here of, let's put it, capitalist competition and the requirements of planning. This guy, Solomon Trom, is very interesting. He's a Litvak, who was a communist early in the 20th century, and how should I put it? He wrote the 5-year plans for Stalin. Get it? The Soviet Union, Soviet Union, when it started in Lenin's time, was backward, like the Tsarist Russia, very backwards. And the communists were determined overnight to create a modern industrialized economy, which means they had to create an amazing infrastructure in terms of roads and factories and huge things for heavy industry and harness the dams and all that kind of business in order to turn Russia overnight, within 10, 15 years, into the #1 military power in the world. Now, that's what they want. And they did do it. Now, it's true, Stalin had to kill 40, 50 million people along the way, but what the heck, Now, if you in Russia, you can do this. You don't have to worry about economics in that sense. Now, this guy wrote the plan. Now, later he got disillusioned with Stalin, and he was Trotsky. He had a whole career. By the end of World War II, he is an international expert, and when he hears Israel becomes a state, he's a Jew. So he says, I'll write him a plan, and he does write him a plan under the UN auspices, in which he says Israel has to create a basic infrastructure if it's going to become an industrialized country, which it isn't. So here's Israel in 48, 49. It's backwards. By that I mean they have a couple of kibbutzim, they have a couple of moshavim, they grow a little bit of olives, they grow a little bit of bananas. That's the kind of country they had. What was the big export in 1949? The answer is Jaffa oranges, and one more thing. No one will figure this out. False teeth. Okay? I'm all in favor of that, but that's a funny basis to build your whole economy out of. Now, we might have some dentists here that will disagree with me, but nevertheless, there you have it. And so, very correctly, he says Israel's he said that was until now, and now we move to chapter 2. Now you're a real country, you got to strengthen by real things. You want to bring in or create industry, you have to have roads, telephones, a port. It was a big problem. Israel did not have a good port. They had to purchase, eventually, after a lot of arguments, an artificial port that they bought from the United States and schlepped it over. Today we call it Haifa. You understand? It's not what you think. Which, by the way, when they bought that port, they didn't know anything. When they installed that port, so the insurance rates went down. You get it? Notice all these things are connected, but they didn't know this any more than I would if I didn't read about it. I'm not an economist, but they didn't know the ABCs and things of this nature. But let me say, the focus on infrastructure is correct. That's exactly what a country, you're not going to get anywhere without that. Okay? Imagine a country is one jungle and doesn't have a road. You're not going to have an economic boom. The only thing is, in order to do this, it requires a lot of money. And you got to take that money where it's located. In Israel, it's located in people's pockets and in the bank accounts. And what that means is there's not going to be the money around for people to buy things like clothes and food. Now, in Stalin, it works. You understand? He knew how to tamp down the consumer demand. It's called Siberia, and he did do it. Well, you can say, you can laugh all you want, but that is exactly what happened in Russia. In the 20s and 30s, as you know, he perfected the state terror system. Everybody was afraid to burp. Read Solzhenitsyn if you don't believe. It's unbelievable. I'm not going to spend time now and describe it. It just was beyond. But then nobody's going to complain about, I don't have enough money to buy clothes. Oh, what are you, a counter-revolutionary? Are you a spy for the capitalists? Are you this? We'll kill you and your family and your neighbors and all the rest. Everybody shut up. Ben-Gurion doesn't have that, I don't know if he even wanted it. But in Israel, you can't tamp down the consumer demands and say anybody who says that they're tired of chatzilim, which is the only thing they had in the majority, is a terrorist. They can't do that. But on the other hand, the Mapai had a lot of power. And they did really control, in almost Stalinist fashion, the imports and the exports. So, this was a government that was elected, but once it was elected, it took to themselves a lot of power that we wouldn't allow in America. For example, you couldn't have butter for the first 10 years in Israel, only margarine. You get it? Which is because all the butter has to, it's a waste of resources, and whatever we have has to go overseas, and things of this nature. Konrad Adenauer, when he first negotiated with the Israelis, he did some investigation in economy. He said, they must be marvelously disciplined, because only margarine? In Germany, they'd shoot me for something like that. So in the first years, no. So people were poor, and they took it. You understand? In the first years of Israel, there generally was a low standard of living, and people just put up with it. Wouldn't go on forever, but people did put up for it. But the problem is that Mapai wants to take all this money and use it for large infrastructure projects, which is true. They took all the money from wherever it's located, they drained it all out of the country. And yet they're committed to a social welfare state because they are socialists. So as good socialists, even if they're not as extremely left as the others, as good socialists, the government, a socialist, a country, provides for the public food, health, education, welfare, housing, social security, even employment. How do you do all this? There's no money. Whatever money is going to be used, we're supposed to be used for the other. Do you see the problem? It's the problem that many of us face. We'd like a lot of things, but we can't afford a lot of things. So what do you do about it? Plus, in order to add to the confusion, which budget are you talking about? Israel Street. The old joke, how many books does this guy have? One he shows us this one, and when he shows his partner, all the rest. Israel really operated on that. Israel has a government. The government has its own budget. And then they got something called the Jewish Agency, which is an official body, the Sachnut, and they have a budget of millions, tens of millions. The housing in Ben-Gurion's time is not built by the government, it's built by the Jewish Agency. Right? And then they have the Histadrut has a budget. So who's building this school or this road? Is it the Histadrut? Is it the government? Is it the Jewish Agency? Why do they run it that way? There's always a reason for everything. You see, they don't want to build a house for the Arabs. But if you say it's the government, you can't discriminate. But if it's a Jewish agency, then it's not a government. You see? That's how you cheat. So this is the way it ran. The government, I can't understand anybody who wasn't on the inside who could figure out how the books ran, which is exactly the way Ben-Gurion wanted it. Nobody knew what's flying because it's this group. Incidentally, that way you get to hire 3 sets of relatives, of friends. Some are on the government payroll, some is in the Histadrut payroll, some are in the Sachnut payroll. You laugh all you want, there's a lot of people who are umzistige fressers, meaning there's a lot of people who don't do anything, but they need a job, and she's married to my sister-in-law, as my uncle, as my this, that, and the other. I've always been good friends with your grandmother's brother, and you take a look at him and her as a schlepper, they're never going to do anything in business, but we can get them a job in the machlaka so-and-so of the Sachnut, and maybe they can even be for 6 months in Zurich or in Paris, in which point they can live like real men and all the rest. So it's a cronyism, you see. Now, who pays for all this? The taxpayer. This is the problem. But this is how Israel ran in those years. Now, in the first years of the state, in 49, 50, 51, these guys went broke. That's all. And the great economic crisis of 1951, which I described in the past, to put it in simple terms, Israel imported twice as much as it exported. Right? That was when Kaplan was, in fact, all these tsars killed him. He had a heart attack because he got the bill, you know. But again, to be fair about it, you have to look at two sides. Israel, in the middle of all this mishigas, doubled the population. They doubled the population because that's what we're about. So we can't understand that, right? They went from 650 to 1,300. So that's a lot. They doubled the population between Iraq and Poland and Morocco. You know what I'm talking about. And so, and it's a good thing they brought them in. But on the other hand, they didn't have houses for them, they didn't have jobs for them, the Ma'abara, all the things we talked about in the past. And just think what that adds to the financial burden. So it's just unbelievable, you know? Now, what they didn't want to do in those years is something they ended up doing 20 years later, which is ask Uncle Sam to foot the whole bill. Okay? It's very interesting. You know, eventually, long time, they didn't think they could get away with it. If they could have saved themselves a lot of trouble, just go to Truman and say, listen, we're broke, we need $1 billion or something like that. You do it in various ways. They didn't do it in those years. They tried to somehow or other make it on their own, even though they got a certain amount of money from America, but not as much as you would think. And so they couldn't do it. It resulted in a huge economic crisis. Things got to the point where the banks wouldn't lend Israel money. Russia would not sell them oil. They used to get the oil from Russia. What do you do when your credit's out? Okay? What do you do? And, you know, it is true in the international community. There is such a thing as doing Chapter 11, but it's got consequences. You understand? And so what's going to happen over here? The rationing system, which we talked about in the past, the Tzena, which they thought would see the country through hard times, crashed due to political unpopularity. I told you, Dov Yosef tried to do a business. Remember, everybody should only eat chatzilim, you should only wear brown pants that they'll sell you every Thursday for six tickets, you know, brown tickets and yellow tickets and things of this nature. None of that worked. And since Israel has one virtue, and that was, it is a democracy. By that I mean at least once every once in a while there's a vote. So when it hit everybody, mamish in the pocketbook, like I just say over here, when it hit them at the area of your children's clothing, and you can't buy shoes and all the rest of it, the voters came out in 1951, they dropped them up high a little bit, and they doubled and tripled the capitalist party, the general Zionists, and that was like a wake-up call. And so as a result of that, they said we got to do something different, but it left behind a long-term economic problem, which is the black market, which is still not totally gone from Israel, but it's basically gone from Israel today, right? But many of us are old enough to remember not that long ago when the black market was flourishing. Whoever got off the airplane and cashed your money in a regular place? You know, what are you, nuts, you know? Even if you did that, the banker looked like you must be crazy, you see? So, isn't it sad that we all wink? Right? I just said that, everybody knows what I'm talking about, all wink. That's not the sign of a healthy country, you see? And so, you know what this says? Exterminate the black market or it will exterminate you. Well, it's a slogan, you know. The fact that you have government control and allocation of resources is always going to mean, whenever you have allocation of resources, the rich and the well-protected know how to get it. You know what they say in Israel? If you know the right people, you don't need protection. Now, by 1952, they already realized printing a lot of money just makes inflation, wipes out. That was it. So they went through, did that, and you know, that crashed over there. So Kaplan, you know, by 1952 says we can't print any more money. So what are we going to do over here? Now, it's not like Israel had any real economists advising them in the early years. They thought that just as they defied the laws of economics back in the 1920s, they can do so when they're real estate. It didn't work, right? I mean, they got, Dan Patinkin moved to Israel from the University of Chicago, but he was just starting out. It took him 5-10 years to actually gather around a couple of Israelis, teach them a few things about economics, and then send them all to the Misradim, you know, to all the ministries and try to say, no, 1 and 1 equals 2. It doesn't equal 2.5, you know, and, you know, that sort of thing. Now, so what do you do? In 1952, February, things have reached a bottom line, and Kaplan, Eliezer Kaplan, the finance minister, the guy who ran this, introduced, like Lenin, the NEP, the new economic policy. He said, we just have to take new, more realistic steps. One thing they stopped doing is bringing in immigrants. They didn't talk about it, they just did it. Okay? Even though Ben-Gurion makes this speech, every Jew in the world has to move to Israel, every Jew in America has to move to Israel, we're going to bring them in. They know, not in 52. They said, we're broke. The first big idea was Israel bonds. At least that'll give us cash in addition to over there. Here is a great film from that guy, Moneson, who they found recently, his color pictures. Here's Ben-Gurion coming in 1952. Can you see this with the lights on? And he had a ticker tape parade down Broadway, Fifth Avenue, all that. Isn't that right? It's all part of the big, and the Jews, by the way, had a ball. Yeah, a Jewish leader, the Jewish flag. It doesn't get better than that in 1951. You know, it's in there. Look at this. And every macher in the ZOA, you know, is getting in the cars. And the idea was sell bonds, sell bonds, sell bonds. Okay, now that worked. That's a start, right? Notice that is something over there. Look at that big. Mom should take her tape parade. A second thing, look, New York is always the best place for reception of Jewish notables. Would you agree with that? Yeah. You know, not San Francisco. Look at this one. You know, there's the mayor of New York. Remember Jimmy Walker? And he was kicked out for various things I can't mention in the show. So this is his successor, and he's greeting, naturally, he wants to give the key to the city to the father of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Okay? Back in 1932. You know, so New York's the place to do it. But in all joking aside, Israel bonds started bringing some real money. Not enough to balance the books, but still it's real money. Second of all, more important, Germany. In 1952, they signed Adenauer and Shimon, what do you call it? Moshe Sharett signed treaty at I think it was Luxembourg or something, and Germany committed and did pay about $90 million a year. Right, where I come from, that's money, and in the 50s, it's real money. Okay, today it's nothing, but you know, the real 50 money. It was maybe $85 million a year. That's, understand me well. That's government to government. In addition, they started sending checks to Holocaust victims and things like this. That's separate from that. So to get straight money, that was like an unbelievable shot in the arm, because Israel was desperate. And if you combine the Israel bonds with the 85 million, now the 85 million did not, was not in cash. Okay, this was the typical German. Nothing wrong with it. This was their way of following a sound German economic policy, and they said, we'll give you $85 million a year in goods. And Israel sent a commission, purchasing commission to Bonn, and they got together with the Germans in good faith, and that's how Israel put its infrastructure together. We need to make a factory for this, so the Germans said, we will construct a factory for you. We need machines to build roads, for dentists, you know, for, you get what I'm saying? You know, all kind of high-tech stuff. And it's German stuff, which is good material, and it's the most modern, because Germany was wiped out in World War II, so they're rebuilding it, so everything's modernized. And 85 million a year in goods. You know, harbor stuff, granary things, as I say, tools for factories, all that sort of business. It's not exactly cash, but it's of vital importance in creating the infrastructure. Of course, you realize that it'll all be for the Histadrut. You get it? In other words, all the construction jobs in Israel will be by the Histadrut's building firm, as we'll see in a minute, Sola Bonnet. But still, in spite of, so there's a certain cronyism going in there. But nevertheless, if they help us build a road, that's a fact. You understand? And if they help us build a factory and equip it with the equipment, that's a fact. So that's of extreme importance. They stopped printing a lot of money, so they stabilized the currency. So they cut down the inflation that way. They actually did a radical devaluation of the lira to realistic levels to encourage exports. That's what smart people do. Dumb countries, till today, for sentimental reasons, are hesitant to devalue the currency because it makes their, country look weak. But those who know economics know that very often it's important to do just that. As you know, I don't have to tell you, China and these countries are deliberately keeping it low, not allowing it to go to the regular level to help their exports. So as Israel starts to take a couple of steps, which are in the first chapter of any economics book, you follow? But they are important first principles. Israel raids all the bank accounts and takes a 10% loan. Says, we'll pay you whenever we pay you. So that's another way of getting money. So it was a tricky business to be over there. They do a lot of high tariffs to keep luxury goods out, because one of the big problems you have is when people start making money, they start buying junk from overseas, and then the money goes out the drain. We want to keep the money in the country. By 53, 54, Kaplan is dead. Eshkol takes over. Levi Eshkol. This becomes his era, his tkufa. Levi Eshkol had no education, but he knew he didn't, and therefore he surrounds himself with economists, these guys that are just graduating from Patinkin's crash course, and there's more rationality in the system, but it's still subordinate to Mapai ideology and self-interest. I mean, just get used to it. That's the way it's going to be in Ben Gurion, down to Golda Meir, and even afterwards. This is one of the things that holds the Israeli economy back from what it's able to do in the early 21st century. It could have happened earlier, at least that's the argument, but it didn't, and there were reasons that it didn't. Eshkol himself becomes the finance minister, so he puts the guy in charge of the, what do they call it, the Miskar v'Ta'asiyah, the industry and commerce. Notice the government departments that run on the dated things, he gives it to this guy Pinchas Kazlowski, Pinchas Sapir, and he becomes Eshkol's Eshkol. Over time, the two guys learn on the job. That's what happens. They have all the 50s to play with. They make one mistake after another, but the whole trick in life is make the mistake once or twice. Don't make it more than that. And so you do lose money along the way, but eventually you figure out what not to do. They're a strange duo, as I said before. They don't know economics. They're not technocrats with higher education, but they organically know where every foot of pipe is because they themselves installed it over the decades. So it's interesting, Eshkol knows what's on every kibbutz, not because he read it in a chart, because he was the guy that did it in the 20s and the 30s. He knows how much food is located in this area, because that's the kind of thing that interests him. He's not interested in Kant and Tchaikovsky, but he's interested in how many tomatoes is growing in this. That's the type of guy he is. You understand? How many square feet of storage space is there in the Haifa harbor? All that kind of junk interests him. They employ economists and technocrats as soon as the university produces them, but they also retain numerous Mapai politicos, and you have mixed results. So the 50s is going to be characterized by a lot of places in the Israeli economy where these young guys are saying, don't do this, this, and this, and the boss of the firm says, he said, but these three guys are redundant. You see? Sooner or later we'll do something over here. That's how life was. Listen, this is Baltimore, Maryland. I'll tell you a story. Tommy D'Alessandro Sr., long ago, was the mayor, and he had all these relatives on the payroll. And the Baltimore Sun asked him, he said, there's three palookas sitting outside your office, under the dome, and they're not doing it. They're on the payroll. What are they doing? He says, their job is, if there's ever earthquake and it starts to shake, they got to warn me in time to get out of here. That's how City Hall was run, and that's how the state of Israel was run. That's an economic enterprise in the Israelite. What is this guy's job? His job is to be my cousin. You understand? That's a job. You have to understand. So there's a constant tension. The young guys there, they're saying, listen, let's open a new thing, eliminate this, move this here, do this right, reorganize the books, all the rest of it. And some of it happens, and some of it doesn't happen. You see? And that's how it goes. As a result, by the time we get to what we're talking about tonight, 1957, things are much sounder. German money is channeled into physical infrastructure, which is a sound prerequisite for future growth, and it's also a way of preventing inflation. Because this is a big problem that Israel, like every other industrial country in the world, will have to battle. By that I mean, if there's a lot of money floating out there, the prices will go up. And so what you want to do is suck up all the money, if possible, and put it in the government to channel it for real projects. You understand? Here's David Horowitz, who is the president of Bank of Israel, director general of MISC. These are the big elites who run the Israeli economy, and he's a real economist. He says, if people are going to start making more money, if we're getting money from Germany, God forbid, all this money's coming in for private people, it's going to jack up the prices. You see? And how do we suck it into the right area? Let me tell you something. The United States of America fought something called World War II. Maybe you heard about it. And one of the things in World War II, the big problem the federal government faced, many people don't know this, and one was, what do you do with all the fact that everybody was doing well, and therefore they were, with the defense contract jobs and all this sort of thing, people make a lot of money, that's going to create unbelievable inflation. And so what Morgenthau did with FDR was they said they had 10 million war bonds drives. Okay? Maybe some people are old enough to remember that. Everything, every day was a war bond, buy war bonds, buy more bonds, U.S. savings bonds. Now what's the idea? Part of it is, of course, to give the government money, which is true. A big part of it was to take it out of circulation. You see? So it's yours, it's in the bank, you'll get it. But right now, when the war's on, you don't get it, because if everybody now has a lot of money, prices will shoot up, it'll get ridiculous. So then, what's the point? If the house doubles, and the car doubles, and everything else, the expenses double, you didn't gain anything. So if you give it to the government, in by form of a bond, you will get it back, but you understand. So the same thing with Israel. What do they do with the fact that German money's pouring in, and all the other money's pouring in? It says, well, channel it directly to the place it needs to go, which is a fund for, let's say, for example, building a city. So that will employ a lot of people, and it'll be used properly and wisely, and then it won't be used for inflationary purposes. So all these things get in there. As a result, in the years 57 to 61, a lot happens in Israel. Roads, a lot, okay? Housing increases dramatically. It's a long way to go, and the Sephardim don't get it, but nevertheless, relatively speaking, the housing, in terms of quantity and quality, increases dramatically. Water, oh my goodness, can't have a country without water. Israel has only one place of water, it's up here, Lake Tiberia. And they build this in 57, 61. This is quite impressive. It's called a water carrier. You understand? Because otherwise you simply don't have the water. There's no water, there can't be any life. Okay? So this is a huge this is a classic Ben Gurionist Eshkol project. How many people did it take to build this? The answer is the more the better. Get what I'm saying? The more the better. All right? No, because it's a real job, and it's adding something to the country, and it's putting people on the payroll, and it's not a job of a cousin. It's a real sort of job, and it means that people can move and live here, and businesses can start here. You see what I'm saying? Industries and other things can start because there's a water fountain. Imagine if there wasn't. Imagine if you had to drag the water by a truck somewhere. Doesn't work then. So this all happens in 57. And finally, the electric grid, electricity. They dramatically increase the electric grid so that a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people for the first time ever in the history of Israel get electric light as opposed to the kerosene oil. Any of you from Israel long ago, your parents had with the kerosene lamps and that sort of thing? That's what it was. You understand? This will eventually enable them to have these wild and crazy things called refrigerators, which obviously never existed when there was no electric grid and things like that. So it's really making small, but not small, dramatic and vital improvements to the standard of living. You see? These projects make it possible to make factories and industry on a real semi-capitalist scale, not on a crazy Stalinist scale. I mean, here's a Polish steel mill, which has a double entendre. It's a steel mill in Poland, but it's also doing nothing. You know, Poland went broke because they built under Stalin a huge capacity for steel, but then they realized they only needed this much. What do you do with the rest of it? But they still had the factories, so they kept churning it out in the communist system. That's why all these communist countries went broke. Israel had people like, believe me, Ben Gurion would like to have a whole steel thing and a whole car industry and all the rest of it. For what? For who? By 1957, they finally got in his head, don't mess with what you're not good at. Israel did not need a steel mill. It's actually cheaper for us to buy the steel from Poland because they got too much. You see? And what they'll do is we'll sell them olives for steel. You get it? No, that makes sense economically, correct? Makes sense? So they're learning the basics. You see, a person who doesn't understand automatically says, I want to be like mercantilist, autarchical, like in the 17th century dream. Israel should grow everything it needs. There was a huge celebration when Israel produced its pencils because they figured out that they didn't have to import pencils. They produced enough of the lead from the Sodom, from the Dead Sea area. Look, I'm all in favor of Jewish pencils as much as the next guy, but that's not what you pour a lot of money into, you understand? These are stupid prestige projects which don't really do anything. You got to get out there in the real market, okay? Now, so these provide real jobs, everything I mentioned. They're not Mapai jobs, but Mapai gets the contracts. This guy, Hillel Don, was the head of the solar bund. He's the historical guy. He gets all the contracts to build the roads and the factories, and therefore he puts in X amount of real workers and X amount of cousins, right, so to speak. That's the way it goes. By the late 50s, what we're talking about is not exactly socialism, but state capitalism. in which the state gets all the money and decides on the projects. But then what it does is, it doesn't build them themselves, it creates companies or gets people to make companies, and then it channels the contracts to those companies. So this is always going to be a certain crony capitalism. Here is a Frum guy that I mentioned before, who later was a big macher in the Agud and the Knesset in Menachem Begin's time, where he was one of the beneficiaries of this system. He came from Poland, and the family had, in Poland, a history of having, what shall I say, carpet factories, basically where they make carpets, using Polish labor. He came to Israel. Somehow or other, him and Sapir got together, I don't know the story, and Sapir's like this, you know how to make a carpet industry, that's a real industry that we can use in Israel, I'll give you $1 million, okay? And the guy gets $1 million, and as a result becomes rich. By the way, what I'd like you to do, since I gave him $1 million, is I got 3 friends of mine who, who I would like to put over here, and 4 friends over there, and 5 friends over there. It's the mafia, but that, the guy does it. Okay, it's the price of doing business. You just charge a little more for the carpets. That is how the system ran. And if his price is too high, he'll get a subsidy from the government to lower the price. So this is all artificial, but we do it in America. We talk about ourselves economically as the land of the free and the home of the brave. But if you ever look at what the lobbyists get, how many businesses in America, industries, get significant subsidies from the government? I'll just give you one, and I don't even know what I'm talking. I'm not an expert in this at all, but I hear a little bit out of my left ear, out of my right ear, that the people who are trying to get alternative oil sources are getting this and this and this, right? And methanol, ethanol, and all that sort of. And the oil companies in the United States of America, which I'm told are not poor, have been getting significant subsidies since the 1920s. Okay, Roosevelt tampered with everything except the oil depletion allowance. You follow? I'm just telling you that all these sorts of things are characteristic of many countries. They don't have a pure capitalism. In the 1950s and 60s, many Asian countries, not African, many Asian countries go this route. It's not a free market. It kind of works, sort of. Here's a classic example in Korea. South Korea was economically dysfunctional until the early 60s. Then this guy became the dictator, and eventually the president, whatever they call it in Korea, is a dictator. And he implemented exactly what I just told you. You see? He got the cronies in there, he found people knew how to set a business, and you know what I know. South Korea took off. Now, there were flaws with it, but nevertheless, over the course of 20 years, they built up a gigantic industrial complex. You can't take it away. Perhaps the most important factor of the late 50s, most important positive factor, is the significant increase in worker productivity. That's the way out of your problems. Okay? Management, under technocratic prodding, is finally learning in Israel how to get more out of the workforce, even with the Mapai inequities, even with the cousins on the payroll. But if you teach people how to work more intelligently, then they can produce more. Let me give you an example, right? And I'm not an economist. Let me give you an example. You have a factory with 1,000 workers in Israel, but really they need 700. So the other 300 are a drag and they're expense. In capitalism, you fire them. But in their eshkol, you don't fire them. So what do? It can't go on like this in the long term. If you do, you end up like Russia. Look at the next one. How come Russia went down the tubes? They never got rid of those extra 300 guys. The only way out, if you're not going to fire them, there's only one way out, and that is to increase production. So let's say the 1,000 workforce produce 100 cars a year, which they sell 1,000 apiece. The profits are not sufficient. But if you get that workforce to make 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 cars or more, the profits get big enough that it'll cover the extra 300 workers. It's not ideal, but it does work. You follow? In other words, if you get the workers to turn out more things and you sell more things, you'll make more money, and the money you make at least will cover your problems. This is the Mapai plan. The idea of just ruthlessly cutting out the 300 and you giving up their control in the economy and their ability to hand out jobs is not up for discussion. Ben Gurion wants to keep that. Eshkol wants to keep that. Sapir is the personification of that. But Israel does make strong strides in this direction in the late 50s. In fact, this will continue until 1965. Worker productivity increased rather interestingly over the late 50s and all through the early 60s. The economy develops, therefore, at a big growth rate in the late 50s and early 60s in this era, 10% a year. That's gigantic. Right? 10% a year is gigantic. That's with the 300 cousins on the payroll. I mean, in other words, that's what makes it really interesting. So in other words, this is Rube Goldberg. This is 300 cousins, but they're covering it with German money and with the Israel bonds. and with Truman and Eisenhower, and with South Africa, and with this and that. But at the end, it works, right? Welcome to the Mapai economy. That's how Israel operated in there. Look, 10% growth rate a year means new factories, etc. If you build enough new viable businesses, eventually it will soak up the unemployed. This does in fact happen by 1961. According to the figures, now figures are always played with, as we'll see in a moment, but according to the figures, they basically got rid of unemployment by 61. That's remarkable. You understand? Even better, eventually there'll be a shortage of labor by around 63, 64, and so the factory with the extra 300 workers will then be able to fire them, because then there'll be enough jobs waiting for them in the other place. You see? And that's in the expanding economy. This is the notion of expanding economy. Now, I'm being oversimplistic over here. Guys who have been used to working nothing jobs, the extra 300 for 10 years aren't going to turn into paragons of productivity overnight in the new situation, but at least we got them out of there and where they should be. Agree? No, it's significantly better. However, in the long run, and here's where economics plays games on you, after 61, the economic growth will be so big, it will lead to labor shortages. And what do labor shortages mean? Higher wages. And what's wrong with that? Well, what will higher wages do? They'll undo the results of increased productivity. Okay? Because then the people want to buy more stuff, especially from overseas. Then the money you just made gets spent on Narishkeit, and then the country has crisis again. Isn't economics fun? It's not a solution, but it's an aspirin, or maybe ibuprofen, right? It's better than the alternative, okay? In other words, by the late Ben-Gurion era, he had nothing to do with anything I'm talking about, as you can see. Right? This Ben-Gurion era is not Ben-Gurion. He was dealing with the A-bomb. He was dealing with de Gaulle, with Kennedy. He's dealing with the spies and all that kind of stuff, with the building up the army, Arab threat. Ben-Gurion realized that. I never went to college. I don't know economics. Eshkol, that's his thing. You guys handle it. Just make it work. Okay? Now, an important driver in this economic growth is Shimon Peres, who in the late 50s, in the years I'm talking about, 57, 61, builds up a military-industrial complex. It's a little one, but nevertheless, by Israel standards, it's very significant, because every country I've ever heard of that became chashuv in the 20th century, with the exception of Japan, did so through a military-industrial complex, right? That they sucked up all the college graduates. I'll use just two words that maybe people here will remember from the old days as big employers. Defense industries, right? Where'd your father work? No, but I do mean it, okay? And the defense industries. And so it's PUE by U.S. standards, but it's significant by local standards. Israel builds all the weapons, starts building their own weapons, short of tanks, planes, and high-tech weaponry. So by 58, 59, Israel's in holding that they got to import pistols, they got to import rifles, they got to import bullets, they got that sort of thing. They're making their own. And when you make your own, of course, you want to sell it. It's not exactly economical, but Peres has great energy and imagination. This was his golden years, as I said it. And he uses his unique Rolodex to create a export market for the products of his military-industrial complex. So I showed you last time. There is the defense minister of Germany, and they're using Uzis. Now, Germany does not need Uzis. But since Peres was friends with Franz Josef Strauss and some of these other guys, he said, listen, do us a favor. I know Germany's giving us money. Here's another way to give us money. Help the business. The German army is 500,000 men, so that's a good. He goes to Norway, he goes to other countries, and maybe can buy this, maybe can buy that. That will be part of Israel's exports. We've moved beyond false teeth to weapons, and I hate to say it, it's sad, but weapon sales is a major component of most industrial countries in the second half of the 20th century, agreed or not, including a country called the United States of America. You see, one of the things we have is Boeing and General Dynamics and that sort of thing. They're not creating toys. You see, it's a necessity in the world. Thus, it provides. Look, what Peres does during these years is to create a native high-tech sector of the economy. Now, unfortunately, from hindsight, Israel didn't use its high-tech that Peres created by the 60s to go capitalist and what called the startup nation. That happened 30, 40 years later. But they did create high-tech companies. Now, they did them for the very narrow purposes of the defense industry. But nevertheless, it provides employment for science grads, guys who come out of Technion and places like that, and it prevents a brain drain, at least to a big, you know what I'm talking about, right? Where to go to America or somewhere else where to get a better job. Paris at least says like this, stay in Israel, we will get you a job here, locally. Israel, which a few years earlier had to steal pistols for the Palmach from Czechoslovakia, by now is an arms exporter with the big countries. How does Israel know Idi Amin and Haile Selassie and other leaders in the third world? The dirty truth is they know because they sell weapons. You see? Of course, publicly they'll talk about the fact that they build hospitals, which is true. And they help them in schools and collective farms and things like this, which is true. This is also true, right? And if you ask Haile Selassie which is more important to him, the fact that Israel helped him build a kibbutz, or that they provided bodyguards with training and gave them all Uzis, you know what the answer is going to be. As I said, it's not orthodox economics, but sales are sales. And the more Germany buys from Israel, the more significant it helps the Israeli economy. But as we know, arms sales make strange bedfellows. There was a big scandal in '58, nobody remembers this anymore, thankfully, when a boat heading towards Nicaragua, loaded with old Palmach and whatever weapons, was going to Somoza, the dictator over here, and was caught in the high sea somewhere, I forget how, and all hell broke loose, and Golda Meir said, oh, this is terrible, and Shimon Peres said like this, he said, well, listen, we got all this old stuff lying around, I'm trying to make money out of it, and Somoza will buy anything, you know, and so this is, no, this means you're moving beyond the idealistic picture of the man and the woman, the brawny and suntan working in the kibbutz, to the real world. Israel tries to get into the common market because they got to trade with Europe, and during these years, if you don't do that till this day, till we're speaking right now, Israel's main trade is with Europe, for better or worse. I mean, it's caused a lot of trouble, and it puts a pistol to Israel's head, because if Europe sides with the PLO, which it looks like it's doing, it's going to be in big trouble if they economically boycott them. That's a problem. But nevertheless, they're the people who are nearby who have these kind of advanced economies that you can do business and buying and selling over here. And so Jean Monnet, who's the founder of the common market, gets together with Peres. Peres gets together with him. And Peres is smart by this time. He's learned on the job. He says, Israel doesn't want a big factory. Israel wants a piece of your operation. Which means if the Germans are creating something called the VWs, the Volkswagens or the Mercedes, let Israel make the exhaust pipe or something like that. Why? It's the Ben Gurion will say like this: Israel doesn't make exhaust pipes for other people. We build our own cars. That's a Polish steel mill. You get it? Paris says like this: look, you fool, you get a piece of Detroit like that, right? If you build the bumper for General Motors, if you built the exhaust pipe for Mercedes, you're in the big leagues. You follow? They're doing us a favor by letting us have a piece of the action. So these are the big debates over there. Another big one has to do with the tomato wars. Maybe you heard of this guy, right? It's weird. You probably wouldn't recognize him, would you? This Moshe Dayan, Ben Gurion, when he won the election in '59, made Dayan Sar Chalkalut, Minister of the Agriculture. He's Tzugapas for agriculture like I am, but it doesn't matter. He said he was a dynamic guy, so he said, we have to win the tomato wars. So Israel, the Israeli people like tomato A, but he found out that the European housewives like tomato B. I forget the name of it, it doesn't even matter. And one was like Moneymaker, and the other was other crazy names. And he says, we got to stop doing tomato A, have to do tomato B. Oh boy, the Tenuva and the Kibbutzim, they all fight against it. Tomato A is the state of Israel, And Dayan said, 10 years ago you didn't even grow this, And these are the big battles, but they do get in the market. You understand? In other words, it does work to some degree, not as much as Israel wants, but now you're a real country. If you're able to use the new technology called airplanes to fly fresh tomatoes to England or a place like that, that's a real market. You see? And so here are the growing pains of the Israeli economy. Despite the GNP growth, the economy still suffers from government control and will continue to do so for another 30, 35 years till they get to this thing over here. Now with the startup nation, even today, and again, I'm not an economist, but I follow a little bit, I know that the real economists are always complaining, even today, there's excessive government control and regulation. There's a certain amount of monopolistic practices from the 9 or 10 or 12 families that run the country. And it's in the way of in other words, so when we talk about Silicon Wadi, it could be 10 times what it is, right? It could be much bigger than it is, which is a shame, because Israel has a big poverty and unemployment problem, and they desperately need the kind of high-tech growth that I'm talking about. And instead of saying, look how great we're doing, and they are doing with what they're doing. I mean, I don't have to speak to you about the amazing things that Israel's producing. It could be much, much bigger, but there's still these leftovers in the system which prevent it. The living standards, nevertheless, are going to rise. And the late 50s sees the first time that living standards rise, at least for many. First, the Germans. What do I mean when I say the Germans? The Yankees who moved to Israel in the 30s, the ones that not in the Holocaust. But under Adenauer, they get a check because they lost their business. In other words, they get the best of both worlds, so to speak. They didn't get hurt physically, and they get a check because they lost their property. You got it? So starting in 57, 58, 56, in those years, this is the new elite. Imagine living on an Israeli salary and getting a check once a month from Germany. That's a big, you know what I'm saying? They get $50, $60 in the 50s. Even in America, $50 or something. And in Israel, it's revolutionary, you see? Then come the non-German Holocaust survivors. That's the people who went through the camps. They did suffer, they did lose, and they're getting money from Germany also. So now you have two groups, which are not insignificant in the state of Israel, that have an advantage over the next door neighbors. They get an extra check in the mail. Then they're the college grads. They're beneficiaries in the system because there's a new economy and there's work for them. So a guy with a degree from the Technion will get a job on the Shimon Peres or something like that, a real job. So they're benefiting. For the first time, Israel has a certain amount of consumerism. So instead of living strapped in such a hand-to-mouth existence with nothing to buy, all of a sudden there's stuff to buy. You start to see, at least among segments of the Israeli population, a luxury. Not by American standards, but by their standards. But, my friends, none of this applied for the Sephardim. There's that huge racial gap. It just is. During 57 to 61, the gap widened larger than before. Precisely because here's a bunch of people that are not getting aid checks from Germany. And here's a bunch of people that don't have any education they can't get in the new economy. And so what happens to them? The racism is blatant as never before. As the government has two policies for Olim. Ashkenazim go to housing in good areas. The Sephardim go to Netivot and the Ari Pituach. It's the new version of the Ma'abara. And Eshkol is insensitive. He said, listen, we wish to put you in a transit camp. Now we take you straight to Yerucham. You're right? Yeah. What happens when you end up there? It's better than a Ma'abara. You get it? And it's really a problem. People can smile today. Was it the Ashkenazim get the good jobs? The Sephardim, as we've heard in this country, last hired, first fired. That's the way it goes. Eshkol and his group, they say we have to treat the Ashkenazim better or they'll turn around and won't come. The Sephardim are going to come either way. Well, that's a pretty lousy way to operate. You understand? That's taking cynicism to new levels because they don't suffer. And by the way, it's not true. 250,000 North African Jews in 57 to 61 go to France and not Israel, including the great majority of Algerian Jewry. So they vote with their feet. And who can blame them? I mean, let's put it this way. This is sad what I'm about to say, but it's a fact, and people knew it. Who's going to give a Jew a better deal? This guy or this guy? Who's going to give you a better life? De Gaulle or Ben Gurion? It's a fact. Now, it's people go, and they put their nose down and all the rest of it. That's pretty disgusting of you if you're saying because you're ashamed of that, you're going to assign somebody from North Africa to a lousy life. They don't want to hear that. You understand? You've got to be realistic. For those unlucky enough, and I repeat, unlucky enough to make Aliyah during the Ben Gurion period, no high school, so there's no new economic future for the youth if you're a Sephardi. In short, a Ferguson was built up, and I use that term advisedly, and a Ferguson is what exploded. It's remarkable, the parallels. On July 8th, a hot night in the summer of 59, just before the elections. It's mamish exactly Ferguson. It's called the Wadi Salib riots. Wadi Salib is the name of a slum neighborhood in Haifa, where they packed in a bunch of Sephardim into an old where the Arabs abandoned. The housing was substandard, below substandard. It's packed in like chickens. It was a terrible kind of a life. It's a hot night. It's a fight in a bar. The Israeli police show up. They get into a fight with the drunks, and they shoot one of them. And they shoot the guy in the foot. But just like happens in Ferguson and so many other areas, by the next day the rumors have spread that the police shot somebody. Does this sound familiar? Okay? And they killed him. Now it wasn't true, but that's what they thought. And so what happens over there? The result is that the police show up. Look, here's the guy that was killed in Ferguson. Look what the cops are doing in Wadi Salib, the Israeli police. They're smashing kids, they're banging people, they're permanently crippling people, they killed one or two. This is what happened over there. So it's Mamish of Ferguson. On July 9th, meaning the next day, 3rd of Tammuz, my mother's yard side, the riots break out all over the place, just like in Ferguson. People are enraged at the police murder, at least that's how they heard it, of this guy, Akiva Yaakov Al-Karif. He was the drunk guy that was shot. They burst into Hadar Carmel. You know what that is? That's the nice Ashkenazic neighborhood of Haifa. And they throw stones, they smash stores and windows, block traffic, burn cars. They run through the town, deliberately torching every Mapai club and every Histadrut office. You know, that's sending a message. The enemy they see is Ben Gurion. You follow? The enemy they see is Eshkol, it's the establishment. It's a very telling commentary on the Mapai welfare state. Because it should be that these people are the beneficiaries of getting a welfare check every month, and food, and they keep the argument, they keep the price of bread down to a nickel, and the milk down to a penny, all the rest. The enemy is the Mapai, it's the establishment, and this the faith. The unions are the ones who are really sticking it to us. The police react, as happens in America, iron fist. Maybe not today, but as you know, it happens very often in American history, and it happens today also. The police react, as you see, smashing and bashing and killing. I mean, look at that. See, they came with sticks and they whacked everybody around. All the rest of it. North African leaders. I mean, that's what they call them. Swan Africa. That is to say, a native leadership emerges from the rioters, from the Moroccan Jews and things like that, and they proclaim a general strike. Riots spread to Tiberia, Beersheba, and Migdal Emek. So these are territories with a big Sephardic population, which are stuck in the same slums. Okay? And where the government lied to them, they say, you come to Israel, everything will be great, and at least when you come here, we'll give your kids a decent education. They didn't do any of it, therefore they're venting their rage. Now, the problem is that it's the old generation. It's the Ben Gurion generation. They don't get it. It's a culture thing. They're not even sensitive to what's happening. The cabinet reacts harshly in a very racist manner. They're quite blind to the complaints of the Sephardim. Eshkol says, I told you not to bring human junk to Israel. Right? Look what he says over here. Look what a jungle we've created for ourselves. That's nice. This is in the cabinet. Eshkol, he wouldn't accept the complaints that discrimination and economic what should I say, pressure is the fault. Instead, he attacks the protesters. They're the ones who are guilty. Same thing you hear in America. So, what do you want from these people? You give them a check, they spend it all on booze, on arak. You understand? There's not the slightest social or economic reason for these riots. It's all a lie. Right? One guy is complaining that the poverty has reduced him to becoming a pimp. Who made him do that? Trying to say, clueless. Okay, these are published remarks. He doesn't get it. Let's go to the next one. What's it called? Eshkol Yechesi, you do have any bafkanot, leminag arts motzoam, shomo no mukabal. He said, what do you want from the Sephardim? They come from Africa, they come from the Arab countries. They're rioting, throwing stones, minhag mukabal. That's the way they live over there. Notice they're barbarians. Bottom line is like this. Me? My fault? Your fault. You see? He's not the only one. Let's look at this. The Mordechai Namir, the Minister of Labor, Mapai. He says, "Rak lofnei mispar shavot shamati shebegin omar shalban shamat." I heard a few weeks ago that Begin said that Israel is now facing an unprecedentedly revolutionary situation. Eshel Ismochalov, he's right. It's all the fault of Menachem Begin. Get it? No, what do they say in America? Outside agitators. You ever hear that before, right? Yeah, people come from the other place. Begin's agitation caused them to go riot, to throw stones, to attack the Jewish agency headquarters, to smash the Histadrut Club. It's all Begin. So once again, it's not our fault, said the cat. Right? Let's see the next guy, Mordechai Bentov. He's a socialist from the Mapam and all the rest of it. The police are too, what's the right word? Police are too meek. All right? Yeah. Stop using words on them and yoster masim. No, start shooting people. We need strong power on the part of the police to crush the rioters. This is a socialist government. You start to see why the Sfardim came to hate everything associated with the labor movement. B'chor Shetrit, who's Sephardi himself, but he's like Uncle Tom. Okay? And what is he? No, that's what he was. So he says he's basically a disguised Mapai, right? This is starting to affect the local Arabs. Right? The Israeli Arabs. Hey, Mafchin Liros, the Arabs are seeing a bad example. If the North African Jews can behave like this, right? And we react with kid gloves, then what will happen with the Arabs? So once again, nobody is talking about the actual problem, are they? Finally, the only guy I found that was a little bit realistic, although you wonder where he's been living, was the Mapam Minister Moshe Carmel, who was a famous Israeli general in the 48 war. He did a lot, and he was the transport ministry, and he said like this. He says, the situation with employment, and the matzav involving shikun, we have a problem. There's no employment, there's no housing. You see? Who's Shorish Parah Russia? That's the problem. That's the bitter root. Bikarti bekama kamos ma'abarot haiti mizazeh adem nishmat. I was shocked. I'm happy he did this, but where you been for 9 years, you know? I visited the Ma'abarah, the new towns. Lo yadati shebim dinas tmuros ke. I didn't know in the state of Israel there such pictures existed. Sure, because he moved from Hadar Carmel to Dizengoff Street to the Knesset, back to the, you get what I'm saying? I'm trying to share this with you to show you the unbelievable psychological and cultural gap, which was a generation gap, which prevented this generation from being able to do anything about it. They could have done something about it, but when there's a cultural thing out there, it ain't going to happen. You know, usually it's a generation kind of thing. The closest thing I would approximate today, this is my own personal opinion, obviously, that's all you get here, is the reaction you see now with these stories of abuse, right, among educators and other authority figures. And you see people of a certain age, whether rabbis or laymen, react in one way, and younger people just have a different reaction. It's a more sensitive. It is what it is. It's really a generational change, and you're not going to expect somebody over a certain period to just get it. And the same thing happened, unfortunately, in a much wider area. And this is about half the population of Israel I'm talking about over here. Okay, this Friday, half the population, maybe more, and it's pretty shocking. Now, what does Ben Gurion do? He appointed a commission, like we said before, under Judge Etzioni. That's how you do it. And this is published material. It's pathetic testimony, right? I'll read you out loud what you see on the screen. This is one of the guys talking to the investigation committee. He's a Sephardi. Al Takshu, don't think that all the Moroccans want to live in Wadi Salim. Rubam Rotzima, most of them want to go to the border. So he said, no, we obviously the Ashkenazim would say like this. We put you in Haifa, and you're away from terrorism, so you should be glad. And you're not living on a border. He said, we'd rather go there. Rak Shania B'nai Adam. Just treat us like human beings. What really bothers us? Romania, I see that on a ship of Romanian Jews come here, they put them in a nice neighborhood, and they put them in the good areas, and they don't put them in the border areas. You only send the Moroccans to live in the border settlements. All the bad places. I know one thing. B'li Asfardim lo hayta medina. Without us, you wouldn't have the necessary population for a country. So you got to give us the opportunity to live in this country like human beings. I always prayed that I would like my child to go to a summer camp. The Ashkenazim get to go to a summer camp, right? What's revolutionary about that? I can't stand to see the kids in my neighborhood, in my slum, running about half naked or fully naked, and they have nothing to play with, so they have to pick up stones and sand, and they have nothing to eat. I don't like to see in Israel, in my neighborhood, kids running around without clothes because they can't afford it, and without food because they can't afford it. I've been here since 1951. This is 59, right? How come no journalist has ever come to write about us? Only now it is a riot, the journalists show. Where you been? Now we get headlines. I was once in a certain stadium, and Ben Gurion showed up, and he lied to us. He swore at that time that another 2 years, the Ma'abarot and the other bad housing would be fixed. Zeh sheker, right? My mother still lives in a shack, and she'll be there at least another 5 years. They are building houses. I told you, Israel is going through a housing boom. But it costs too much money. It's because 1,000, 2,000 liras. I don't have it. Where are you going to get that? And we are working what you call welfare jobs. Honorable judge, you have no idea the life I'm living at because you never worked in the kind of job I'm at. I tell you straight. I don't eat meat even once a month. Okay? I eat potatoes when I have them. That's the only thing that fills. I have a kid, and maybe 3 times in his life have I been able to buy him a banana. I haven't met one Moroccan that said things are okay. Instead, they said, we wish we would die. All the people in that situation are looking to die, meaning they've given up. Now, it doesn't make much of an impression. I wish I could tell you that it did, but it doesn't make much of an impression because these guys, are not moved, as they say, by the pathetic testimony. Instead, Ben Gurion says, I know one thing, rebellion must be suppressed. It's not the issue, okay? It's not a revolution, it's a middle-class revolt. Do you know the difference? You know the difference between a middle-class revolt and a revolution? A revolution of the working classes wants to destroy the status quo and replace it with something else. A middle-class revolt says, keep the system, but invite me to the wedding too. Right? I want what you guys have. I'm not looking to get rid of it, but have it in here also. If you invite me to the chasana, I'm happy. If I would like to have a house or a decent apartment, then I won't complain. I don't say take yours away. That's Lenin. I don't say take yours away. Keep yours, but get me one too. Ben Gurion doesn't see it. And so the result is that we have a bringing out the Wadi Salib rights, which are famous in the history of Israel, bring out what, as Disraeli famously said so long ago, there are 2 Englands and now there are 2 Israels. There are 2 Israel living side by side, and it's just a shame. And it's a double shame because it's supposed to be a Jewish state, right? So theoretically, Kol Yisrael Chaverim. That's the words. But in the reality, it doesn't happen that way. But things don't change because it doesn't hurt Mapai at all. Mapai wins the election. Hagidu Ken Lazakain. Say yes to the old man. The election's held a couple months later, and through Ashkenazi votes and through Tammany Hall politics, like we saw in Salah Shabbati, he gets more votes than ever before. And so there's no political push to do something, and nothing is really done about this Sephardim. As I told you, it's a generation thing. Golda Meir, late, even 10, 15 years later, said to the Black Panthers, do you remember there was such a group that was in the 70s that picked up where these guys left off? And she says, what are you complaining about? We taught you how to use a knife and a fork. Look, what's that got to do? First of all, I don't know if that's even a lie. But I'm saying, what's that got to do with anything? You follow? It's a generation thing. I've been around shuls all my life, and I know what I'm talking about. It's a generation thing. Okay? Now, In 59, and for another 15 years, Menachem Begin, who's leading the opposition party, is unable to capitalize this for another 2 decades. Meaning, you'd think in the 59 elections, he would shoot up and get a lot of, he didn't. Because the truth of the matter is he wasn't a good campaigner, despite all the propaganda. Later on, it came together. Things moved in his direction. By the time you get to 15, 16, 17 years later, by the 77 elections, the Sephardic attitudes have really hardened. And I'm going to show you a clip now, about 4 minutes, they're very good, of the election, Begin versus Peres, where you see that Peres is trying to kiss up to the voters by giving out prachim, giving out flowers for the elections, and the voters are saying, get out of here, and Peres said, what do you hate us for, and all the rest of it. They say, we'll tell you why you hate you, and then Begin will give a speech, he says, we've liberated the country from 29 years of protexia, right? And the foreign journalists won't get it, but the Israeli guy will get it. So, and you'll see Peres lets it out of the bag. He can't control himself, so he says, you're acting like a bunch of Mizrahi barbarians, you see? So in other words, as I call it, that ain't the smart thing to say in the election campaign, but, but this, and this will hit them over the head. So a lot of people who vote for Menachem Begin in 77, 81 are not voting for Menachem Begin at all. It's that there's 2 types of votes. There's a positive and negative. They're voting to stick it to the Mapai, to the Marachas, they call it that time, and to the guy, and these guys are still clues. In the 70s, 80s, they say, what are we doing? We built up the state. I'm not going to say anymore. Take a look at this. There's Peres in 70. Can you make it louder? Check. He's giving out flowers, Chag Sameach. He's a Sephardim in the Tachana Merkazit of Tel Aviv. And now these guys are cussing him out. You messed this over for 30 years? Poor Peres is trying to, See, Peres hu Yehudi. It's a Peres rally. And the writer A.B. Yoshua, he says, and that Peres kissed up to the Sephardim is disgusting. Nobody ever tried to give him flowers and try to win them over. Don't try to befriend them. Down with the riffraff, down with the mob. Asafsuf is the mob, the Sephardim. But it's a generation thing. And here's the Begin rally. These are almost all Sephardim. In the last 4 years, protexia as a term has departed from Israel, which means Mapai racism. Used to write these little notes to discriminate against workers. We have proclaimed liberty for the masses. There's no more discrimination. You don't prefer one party over another in employment. This is our country, you know. Now you see Paris. What do you hate me for? I'll tell you why. This is Beit Shemesh. You're fascists. You're Chamedius. Buzlucha, shame on you. See, this is a culture, but this is not Mizrachiot here. Don't come in out of your. But now I'll tell you something. He wouldn't do that today. Israel has changed. Okay? Believe me, bougie things are going to kiss up to them. But at that time, I'm trying to. Nobody would believe this if you didn't see this. They literally were clueless. It was a generation thing. And they thought, the Sephardim should all love me. You see? We built up the country. We won the 6-day war. You know? And I mean, you know, and we built a tremendous economy. We have a high-tech sector and all the rest of it. The guys who are cussing him out are not part of the economic statistics. You get it? When they say it's full employment, they leave out the people that don't sign up. You get it? The people who have given up. We have this problem in the United States of America today. I know some of you follow the newspapers. And there's a huge number of them. And these are young people that you saw in the pictures over here. Senators who grew up under the system, and they hate this phenomenon. So I end by, and they didn't get it, incidentally. They didn't get it because you couldn't follow all the things over there. But the newspaper reporter, who was a Mapainik, said, do they think Menachem Begin was born in Morocco? Why are they cheering so much? He doesn't get it. You know, it's remarkable. It's a culture thing. And so I end by asking, how do you define economic success? Right? How do you define economic success? It's a tale of two Israels. These people, this is 1959. They're doing great. It's Ashkenazi elite, secular elite. You tell by the way they're dressed in Tel Aviv, and at the same time, people are living like that. And so, is Israel doing well, or is Israel not doing well? Kind of depends who you are. And when I say who you are, who you look like, where you came from. I'm going to point out, I'm ending with a video that's from today. It's actually put out this past week by Shas. And even though it's a partisan business, you know, now we're living in the age of videos. I know you all follow this. So Bennett is putting out these cool videos that are passing around. So the Shas put one out under their new slogan called Hashkufim, which means invisible. They said, what about the invisible Israelis? I couldn't find the English of it, but pay close attention and you'll see 3 or 4 scenes in which there's a middle-class couple, like in Tel Aviv, and saying, oh, the prices are going up. The middle class is really being crushed. But then they'll tell their maid or the guy in the street who's shown here as invisible, get out of here, or what's wrong with you? And they scream at them because the middle class is all wrapped up in itself. For middle class, read the word Ashkenaz. Get it? You see? And the Shkufim, they're African, they're Sephardim, they're black African as well as white African. You know, they're the losers in the totem pole, and the Shas, who's going for the votes, is saying, we don't care, we're not doeg about the Ma'amad HaBeinayim, about the middle class. They can take care of themselves. But nobody cares about the Shkufim. Nobody cares about the invisible people. We do, vote for us. So I understand the cynical side of it, but nevertheless, the ad would not have a punch if we're not based on truth. So take a look at this. The rent is going up. It's terrible, the middle class. Here's the invisible guy. And they tell him, bug off. I only have a credit card. I want to give you money. He's invisible. There's her invisible maid. I wanted organic flour. The middle class is really getting it. He doesn't want to give this guy a tip. He's invisible. Don't wash my window. Here's her invisible maid. Middle class cannot take it. What about a don't wash the floor when I'm home. We don't care about the middle class. $2 million invisibles. For us, you're not invisible. Good night.